We'll get you talking.
Now, Peter Hitchens, journalist with the Daily Mail Group for the Daily Mail, the Mail on Sunday, and author, and a man who actually lived in Russia and knows Russian society well, is my next guest. Good evening, Peter. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. It's a pleasure.
There seems to be a good deal of complacency around. I listened to the PM programme on the BBC before this began, and the talking head there from Chatham House was pouring cold water on any possibility of the imminent attack on Syria triggering a Russian response. What do you think?
I have no idea. And the difficulty is with wars that you cannot actually tell once you start them what the limits of them will be. Anyone who's expert, particularly on the history of the First World War, will know how very quickly it spread from a fairly localized conflict to effectively a world war, never by anybody's intention. People should always remember with the First World War that when Britain entered it, there was no understanding or intention of having a large land army on the continent of Europe, which ended up being our main activity there. Once you start wars, it is impossible to tell where and how they will end. People should, before they start wars, always remember that. I find the whole atmosphere extremely somber. I've just heard suggestions that the Prime Minister plans to join some attack, although Parliament is not in a position to approve it. So does that mean that Downing Street is now responsible to the White House rather than to Parliament?
Well, Tony Blair, who's busily trying to undo the Brexit decision, claiming that Parliament must have the final say on the matter, encouraged the Prime Minister not to recall Parliament, not to rely on a parliamentary vote, but to join the war anyway.
Yes, well, it's extraordinary how nobody seems to learn anything at all. Of course, I think what people now realise is that if Parliament had known at the time of the Iraq War what it knew later, it would not have voted for it. But whether MPs are any more grown up now than they were before the original Iraq War vote, I don't know. I've spent quite a lot of the past 36 hours encouraging people to write to their members of Parliament and in the United States to their congressmen and congresswomen saying that they don't favour this war. Now I must switch that, it seems, to asking them to write instead to number 10 Downing Street and to make it plain to number 10 Downing Street, presumably email address, that they do not favour this thing, because it just seems to me that some action must be taken by people who don't feel that the proposed war is wise, to at least try to prevent it. Those of us who have consciences want to know that we've done the maximum that we could to stop it from happening.
Now, your reference to the First World War is a good one. I'm reading a tome at the moment called Folly and Malice, which deals with the beginnings of the First World War and establishes, I think, beyond contradiction, that it too began on fake news. The fake news that official Serbia was somehow involved in the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. Even though the Austro-Hungary Empire and their bigger German, more powerful German ally knew full well that Serbia was not involved in that crime. But they suppressed that news in order to use it as a casus belli. Many feel, I certainly do, that the events in Duma are being used in much the same way. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a terrible problem with the events in Duma, and that none of us knows what happened. We're still in this position, and yet I read this morning an editorial in the Guardian newspaper, which everywhere dripped with certainty that the Assad government had actually used chemical weapons in Duma. I can't believe, actually, that serious parts of the media have completely forgotten the basic rule that you investigate first before coming to conclusions. We have no first-hand, no checkable, no objective, no verifiable evidence, even that a chemical warfare attack took place in Duma at all. We certainly have no evidence that any particular source did it. And by the way, I should point out here something quite important. Jaish al-Islam, the Sword of Islam, the body which controls the area of Duma in which the alleged attack took place, or did control it at the time, was actually itself accused of using chemical weapons against Kurdish victims in Aleppo in 2016. So we're not dealing here with some innocent, entirely uncomplicated group of people who've never had any association with chemical weapons versus a wicked government which has. As I keep stressing, you can read this on the Peter Hitchens blog, and you can read it elsewhere, but it's the easiest way of finding it. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons produced a report on the alleged chemical weapons attack on Khan Sheikhoun a year ago. And the thing about this report, and I've read it very, very carefully indeed many times, is that it's quite clear from it that no independent experts ever visited the site of the attack in Khan Sheikhoun. We have no independent experts having visited it. We still have no reliable custody chain, which is essential in deciding the origin of chemical weapons used in such things. Absolutely nothing which could be called reliable evidence. And yet the UN's joint investigative mechanism in September of last year concluded that the Syrian government was responsible. I do not see how they can do that under those circumstances. And this is, of course, I think one of the reasons why Russia is hostile to this joint investigative mechanism and got it shut down. And here again, you see the misrepresentation in much of the media of what's been going on at the United Nations. Both the Russians and the Americans want an investigation into what happened in Duma. But the Americans have coupled this with a demand for the revival of this joint investigative mechanism, which the Russians, for good reason, mistrust. And yet the Russians have been portrayed as objecting to an investigation of the alleged outrage, which simply isn't true. I sit in wonder at the poor quality of this coverage and of the understanding of the nature of the events, and indeed of knowledge of the most basic facts about chemical weapons and how their use is investigated among people who are pontificating wildly about how we should by now be hurling cruise missiles into Syria. And here again, you have another problem. I don't know anything about the likelihood of a war with Russia because I simply don't. I have no information. But let us just imagine for a moment that an American missile strikes a base where there's a considerable number of Russian servicemen and they're killed. That will put the Russian government in a very, very difficult position. They will be under enormous domestic pressure because there is a great deal of extremely ferocious nationalism in Russia, which is kept to some extent in check by the existing government. They will be under enormous pressure to retaliate. And who am I to guarantee that they will not do so? This is the kind of game that we're playing. But fundamentally, the First World War comparison is about in 1914, the great tension was, of course, between Russia and Germany. In 2018, the great tension is between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and this is what is fundamentally going on now. And we are witnessing, it seems to me, an attempt to create, really for the first time, a full-scale war between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East.
I tried in my opening statement to return to the beginning of all this, and I asked the question rhetorically. I ask you now. I asked the Tory MP Bob Seeley in the studio just a half an hour ago. How did it come to pass that Britain supports an organisation called the Army of Islam? Is the clue not in the name? It turns out that British taxpayers' money is being given to the Army of Islam, sometimes called the Sword of Islam, as you say, and they're the people, the only people with the only footage in a basement of the victims of the alleged chemical weapons attack in Duma. How did we end up on their side?
Well, I think the relationship between both Britain and the United States, and come to that, France and Saudi Arabia, is extremely interesting. In the case of the USA, it goes back to the famous meeting between Franklin Roosevelt and Ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy on Great Bitter Lake in 1945. Roosevelt was on his way home from Yalta and forged what has always been the most real special relationship which the USA has ever had with any country. Britain has come more lately, but especially since the Al-Yamama arms deal, which we made under the Thatcher government with Saudi Arabia, has been very close to the Saudi royal family. And you'll notice, if you look carefully at the activities of the British royal family, the number of visits which they pay to Riyadh is astonishing, and the number of visits which senior ministers pay there is astonishing. France is trying also to get involved. It's another country with big Middle Eastern interests and a great deal of interest in selling its military equipment in that area as well. And I think that has a lot to do with it. Saudi Arabia is the force which principally lies behind the attack on the Assad government, because the Assad government is run by Alawites who are not Sunnis. It's probably not accurate to say they're Shias either, but they're certainly much closer to Iran than they are to Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia regards the Assad tribe of Alawites as heretical. And so there's a great deal of both political and sectarian tension between Saudi Arabia and Syria, and this is what seems to have been being pursued. And the countries, the Western countries which have joined in with it, appear to me to have been doing so in the hope of pleasing Saudi Arabia and perhaps winning favours from it. And that will explain the complete and utter illogicality of nations which domestically constantly denounce Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but in their foreign policy actually support the activities of extreme Islamist, I would say extreme, it's a foolish word, fanatical Islamist organizations of the kind which we would denounce as terrorists and set teams of secret policemen on if we found them in Birmingham.
Indeed. And finally, we do have, of course, prior experience, and only a year ago, less than a year ago, another organization, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, again, the clue probably in the name, turn out to have been long-term assets of the British state and its security apparatus. And one of those was responsible for slaughtering our children at the Manchester Arena. It was said of the Bourbons.
I wasn't aware of that connection. I'll have to look into it.
Yes.
I can't comment on it.
All right.
Because I simply have no knowledge of it.
I have a lot of
but
it.
sure,
So
I'm
you
not doubting that, but I make a habit of trying very hard not to comment on things which I haven't personally researched.
All right. But it was said of the Bourbons that they learned nothing and forgot nothing. Given our experience with Iraq, Libya, and Syria now, and the media and political class appear to be the Bourbons of nos jours, don't they? They learn nothing.
Well, it's worse than that. Here's one thing you used to be able to rely on Britain's left-wing press for, and this included particularly the Guardian newspaper and to some extent the BBC, was a healthy scepticism about attempts to drumbeat the country into war. And these are people who opposed the Syria's adventure in 1956, rightly. These are people who opposed the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 1970s, rightly. And these are people who in many cases opposed the Iraq War in the early part of the century. And yet now you look at these papers and they're empty of sceptical comment or of balanced reporting. And I don't know what's happened. It feels as if there's been some kind of invasion of the body snatchers, and the Guardian is perhaps going to have to be renamed the Warmongers Gazette and give away free toy soldiers to its readers. I am completely flummoxed by the way in which the left, which for all its many faults could only be relied on to be sceptical about rushes to war, has become in some ways the most enthusiastic drum major for this war, and seems to have forgotten what it exists for. My impulse in this is fundamentally a Christian one. The just war theory seems to me to say that war is very, very seldom justified, particularly war of choice, and that it should always be regarded with extreme caution. And people will accuse me falsely of taking sides with Russia or of taking sides with Syria, and I can prove. And again, if you go to Peter Hitchens, you can see my reporting on both Russia and Syria, which has been highly critical for many years, often before most people had heard of what was going on in this country. So it's not true. But my sole purpose in all this is simply to say, hold on, wait, verify. First of all, find some facts, then find some logic for what it is you propose to do. At the moment, there are no facts and no logic.
Well, as Mrs. Thatcher once said, it's a funny old world, and you've just described it very comprehensively. Peter Hitchens, thank you very much for joining us.